So we are, it tells me a recording is in progress. So thanks everybody for joining us for the forum. This is one of the first public events for the Tautegory project. We encourage you guys all to check out our website. Please sign up for our mailing list. We mail very sparingly, so it's not going to fill up spam. Next month, we've got a forum, this time on our blog, coming on Eric Hailey's recent book, Humanist Reason, an interesting and ambitious book. And in the spring, we're organizing another series of conversations that'll be locally hosted here in Albany, New York, but we'll have Zoom stuff for that as well. It's provisionally titled Meeting Places, Conversations Between and Beyond the Disciplines, featuring some of the folks who are here. So keep your eye out on that. At present, we're seeking participants and or organizers for people who might want to organize some reading groups. If you're interested in doing that, you can email us through the Tautegory website or just write directly at information@tautegory.org. A few quick reminders. Please mute yourself unless you're speaking and try to use the chat feature sparingly. Today's forum is focused on Joe Rouse's forthcoming book, Social Practices as Biological Niche Construction, coming out from Chicago very soon, we hope. Joe is the heading professor of moral science at Wesleyan, and he's published really widely in the philosophy of science, interdisciplinary science studies, and the social theory of practices. Notable publications include Knowledge and Power, How Scientific Practices Matter, and 2015, one of my more favorite recent books, Articulating the World, Conceptual Understanding and the Scientific Image. Joe's work is deeply in keeping with the aspiration of the Tautegory project, balancing a wide-ranging curiosity with an exacting rigor. His thinking presses past inherited and influential oppositions to articulate a philosophical naturalism that takes the human and social sciences seriously. Joe is joined by 3 respondents who will each present some brief remarks to which Joe will respond. After that, we'll do a question and answer, more open discussion. Our hope is that this set of exchanges will generate questions and comments from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question towards the end or make a remark, please use the raise hand function, and I'll make a list keeping track of who's up to bat, and we'll go through it there. Briefly, I'm going to introduce our respondents in order. So first, we're going to hear from Gary Tomlinson. Gary was trained as a musicologist, and in recent years has focused his attentions on issues of biological and cultural evolution in humans and other animals. This work has resulted in an evolution trilogy founded in an amalgam of scientific and humanist theory. First, A Million Years of Music, the emergence of human modernity, out from Zone in 2015. On the human evolution of musicking capacities. Culture and the Course of Human Evolution, 2018, from Chicago, on the emergence of cultural complexity in ancient hominins, and The Machines of Evolution and the Scope of Music, forthcoming, on the evolution and scope of meaning-making among non-human animals. Gary is Sterling Professor of Music and Humanities at Yale, where for 8 years he directed the Whitney Humanities Center. Next, Mark Risjord will pose a few questions to Joe. Mark is Professor of Philosophy at Emory, an interdisciplinary scholar trained in philosophy. Risjord treats philosophical questions as intrinsic to scientific practice. His writing has primarily contributed to the philosophy of social science and the philosophy of medicine and nursing. In the philosophy of social science, he's written 2 books, Woodcutters and Witchcraft, out from SUNY in 2000, and Philosophy of Social Science, a Contemporary Introduction from Routledge. He's also edited 2 volumes of essays, Philosophy of Anthropology and Sociology, and Normativity and Naturalism in the Philosophy of Social Sciences. Finally, we'll hear from Mark Lantz. Mark is a professor of philosophy and co-founder of the Justice and Peace program at Georgetown. Mark is published on the philosophy of language, metaphysics and epistemology, philosophical logic, but also writes on pragmatism, feminism, metaethics, the foundations of mathematics, anarchist theory, and applied issues of social justice. Alongside Quil Kukla, Lantz published Yo and Lo, the pragmatic topography of the space of reasons, out from Harvard in 2009. He is currently writing a book on revolutionary nonviolence, finishing a paper on the nature of faith that has a lot to do with normative pragmatics and nothing to do with God, his words, not mine, and working with the Truth Telling Project on a wide range of resources to educate and organize around white supremacy. So with that, Gary, you're up.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James, very much for the invitation to take part in this. It's been a pleasure thinking about it and a pleasure now doing it. And many, many thanks to Joe for sharing the 3 chapters that we read from his upcoming manuscript. They're marvelous chapters. It's a marvelous project, and I certainly look forward to seeing the whole thing. I'm going to read a short statement that ends with some questions for Joe. So, niche construction theory. This proposes a dynamic of mutual alteration between organisms and their environments. It follows the ways organisms create niches by exploiting some resources in their surroundings, making affordances of these, but not others. Because populations of organisms construct affordances in this way, they change the balances of the limited resources available in their surroundings, and this means that the organisms themselves are involved in changing the selective terrains of their lineage and of other organisms co-evolving with them. Organisms and their environments are linked across time in feedback cycles of mutual change. This is the basic proposition of niche construction theory, classically voiced in a book by Odling, Smee, Lalland, and Feldman from 2003. Niche construction theorists, including those 3, have tended to advance coarse-grained models and examples, cases of large-scale ecological change across many generations of whole populations of organisms. And there are reasons for this, mostly having to do with pragmatic reliance on the old, trusty, quantitative tools 20th century population geneticists used to model the probability of changes in traits and genomes across generations. Taking on too many moving parts, too many different alleles, too many traits, whatever, renders the mathematics impossibly multidimensional. But we can see qualitatively that there is no lower limit to the scales, temporal and spatial, on which niche construction operates, at least until we reach the quickest intracellular molecular interactions and the quickest times it takes them to express themselves in or be affected by an organism's surroundings. In general, given the ubiquity of niche construction, we cannot find any organism-niche interaction, however fleeting, that is not potentially implicated in the ongoing dynamics that come to manifest themselves in what we call natural selection. We need then to radicalize niche construction, to follow it all the way down to the molecular transactions that come about in the organism-niche relation. These transactions can have small and large consequences in determining whether the genome of an organism contributes to an ongoing lineage or how the genetic makeup of its population as a whole changes across time, which is to say that the plasticity of an organism in the face of its environment is no mere exercising of ontogenetic options that are pre-programmed in its genome. Plasticity instead marks another point along the continuum reaching from individual life processes to broad evolutionary process. Now, this realization carries us over from niche construction to another strain in today's evolutionary theory, biological theory, life science theory in general, which is evolutionary developmental biology, or EVO-DEVO. In recent years, biologists have illuminated the molecular regulatory networks that mediate between environment and genome, transducing environmental signals. And in the process, they've come to see how plasticity brings about moment-to-moment alterations of the genome in response to its surroundings. This is, of course, not to say that the nucleotide sequence of an organism's DNA is constantly altered in plastic interaction with its environment. Instead, it is the expression of the sequence that changes, incessantly adjusted by the regulatory systems inside the cell interacting with those external signals. The regulatory systems involve not only stretches of the DNA molecule itself that control the expression of other stretches, but also an array of RNA transcription factors produced in shifting amounts and the many proteins that they in turn produce. All these ingredients link in loops of feedback, resulting in up and down regulating of the things we call genes. Viewed in another way, all these things effectively remake how a gene can be usefully thought of or defined. And here is the all-important takeaway. Altogether, from proteins and other cell chemicals to transcription factors to the genome, regulatory systems respond in real time to signals from beyond the organism. The mediating systems of evo-devo biology render genetic expression itself a moment-to-moment aspect of radical niche construction. Now, in the broadest view, the impact of radical niche construction on evolutionary theory is to underscore basic questions that have arisen from other quarters in the last 25 years or so. Radical niche construction embraces the processual view of the history of life, advocated by writers such as John Dupre and Daniel Nicholson. In this view, and I quote them, "The right way to understand the living world at all levels is as a hierarchy of processes rather than of things, and it is a mistake to suppose that processes require underlying things or substances." Genomes, intracellular epigenetic systems, organs, organisms, superorganisms, co-evolved networks of different organisms, species, and niches all find their places in this hierarchy, but they are recognized as epistemological snapshots, stills from moving pictures. The stills, of course, are often useful for our conceptualization of living processes. Often, but not always. They are especially problematic in describing evolutionary process. Targets of natural selection, for example, or the advantageous functions that bring about the targeting, or the selection for a function, or the discrete adaptations supposed to emerge. These reify moving processes, giving a static form that doesn't exist to the entities named. The reification results in a conundrum regarding evolutionary causality. The reified entities seem to suggest causal chains connecting them. A function causes natural selection to choose a target, which results in an adaptation. But the causality cannot be followed in the voids between reified entities. It's at this moment of radicalized niche construction, with its turn away from Dennett-style adaptationism, that Joe Rouse's new book intervenes. The species in question for him is the most complexly cultural of all cultural animals, which is to say, us. And culture, usefully defined as learning within a lifetime of archives of practices and knowledge and transmitting these to future generations, culture is presumed to be a fundamental force in our niche construction. This is unimpeachable. So also, according to the radicalized view of niche construction, is the role of culture in moment-to-moment alterations of human organisms in relation to their surroundings. And so, finally, is Joe's scrutiny of cultural practices down to the finest nuances of postures among interacting humans, in keeping with the radicalization of niche constructive process. Joe argues for a nature-culture stance, spelled as one word to signal the utter superseding of a nature-nurture dichotomy in understanding human evolution and attainment. This superseding is not Joe's move alone. I take it to be by now the consensus among all those thinking hard about the evolution of humans and all other cultural animals. And here, by the way, as an aside, the niche constructive view reveals its importance, since its feedback loops expose the fallacy of the genetic determinism that accompanied earlier conflations of nature-nurture in evolutionary psychology, for example. Culture is part of our radicalized niche construction, altering our stances toward our lived worlds on a moment-to-moment basis and changing just as quickly the regulatory balances by which each of us meets the world, all the way down to gene expression. Cultural practices form fundamental aspects of our niche construction, fundamental forces, as I would put it, in the ways the things we reify as human beings meet the world as hierarchies of processes. The task at hand, viewed from my vantage, becomes what we can call an asymptotic challenge. the requirement that our narratives of human cultural practice approach more and more closely the unreachable limit case of a full description of evolutionary process. And this is no small challenge, as those of us who have assayed it know. The three chapters we've read from Joe's manuscript, again, chapters 1, 5, and 6, offer a vivid sketch of how he meets this challenge and provoke questions perhaps raised and answered in the other chapters, I expect so, in fact. So here are some questions for Joe, each emerging from my partial reading and each emerging from the preceding question in a move towards greater specificity. The most general question for me concerns the somewhat fleeting role of niche construction in chapters 5 and 6. It stands, it is true, as a backdrop to everything Joe says, but through long stretches, the backdrop seems to recede very far back. How, Joe, do you manage to keep it toward the front of the stage in chapters 2, 3, and 4, which we haven't seen? How, in general, can we get to the nuance of, I'm quoting you now, an expansive understanding of human biology that incorporates a nature-cultural reconception of social practices? How do we get to the nuance of all that, a nuanced view of all that, when so much of the theorization of social practices, at least in chapters 5 and 6, comes from philosophy and the social sciences? Here's a related issue. Human animality, as you call it at one point, seems to me almost to disappear in the lengthy examples you provide of nursing practices, the college classroom, and so forth. Maybe this is a misreading. This elision, at any rate, is common in attempts to connect the practices of modern humans with evolutionary histories. And in many of them, it has led down the primrose path to crude adaptationism. I'm thinking here of those just so stories of evolutionary psychologists still alive and well in such precincts as literary Darwinism, as it's sometimes called. Joe, you avoid this path forthrightly and happily, but our animality seems at times to get lost in the process. Following out this connected series of questions, we come to your distinction between one-dimensional normativity in the practices of non-human animals, and our two-dimensional normativity. I presume Mark and Mark, the other respondents, will have more to say than I do about the philosophical arguments on normativity. But the evolutionary vantage, but from the evolutionary vantage, this question is begged, and not least by our super competent cousins, the Neanderthals. They look more competent with every new thing we learn about them. Here's the question. Through what niche constructive pathways and histories do we get from one-dimensional to two-dimensional normativity? How did this major transition happen? My own explanations for something akin to it in cultural evolution, elaborated now in those books mentioned by James, concern a transition among many animals, not just hominins, in the cognition of signs, with all its implications for cultural complexity, abstraction, and the like. Do you, Joe, offer us a model for this momentous development? And finally, I'm curious about the role of modern language in your account, signaled and more in the chapters we have. Of course, language forms a context for almost every aspect of modern human culture. Even cultural practices such as music, essentially unlike language in several respects and processed cognitively through some distinct networks, even music is habitually deployed with or in context of language use. But the conclusion seems to me inescapable from several lines of evidence that unprecedented cultural complexity emerged in our forebears in the absence of anything like fully modern language. Any account of human practices in their modern forms requires, of course, taking on board fully modern language. But how do we construct a plausible account of the emergence of complex cultural practice and human two-dimensionality without language? Thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation to come.
Thank you, Gary. Just wonderful. Joe, take on as much of that as you want.
Okay, well, I would like to start first by thanking you, James, and the Tautegory Project, and all of you attending for this opportunity to talk about the book, and especially thanks to Gary and in advance, Mark and Mark, for preparing these responses. Speaking specifically in response to Gary, I want to start by completely endorsing the move to what you're calling radicalized niche construction and to a processual view of life, of living processes. You know, Dupre and Nicholson's book and Dupre's earlier work has been very important in the background of what I'm doing. Now, concerning, I want to move, I think, directly to your three questions. And I think the first question I can respond to by just briefly talking about the intervening chapters. I'm not going to refer to them by number, by the way, because since you got these, they've been renumbered. Chapter 1 is now the introduction, and chapter 2 is 1, and we're going to get all confused. So the next chapter is looking at the history of practice theory and arguing that both its important motivations are really crucial, but that its failings result precisely from the separation of the biological and the social. And then another chapter follows, basically developing my version of what Gary's calling radicalized niche construction, which is really synthesizing a lot of the work in evolutionary biology in recent years. I think of it especially in terms of ecological developmental biology, as well as along with niche construction. And much of that moves towards understanding social relations among human beings as themselves part of organism and environment relations of an organism. And then the next chapter then goes into great detail about human bodies and the ways in which bodies and their grounding, their directedness, their involvement with their surroundings and one another are integral to how we develop and how we engage, the kinds of skills and cognition we have. And the concluding move, of course, is to see practices as the characteristic developmental environment of human beings, and seeing how this kind of interdependence and emerges. Now, of course, one of the things that happens when you select chapters is it hadn't occurred to me that the extent to which these next two chapters were more extensively located with social theory. This was all stage setting to see social theory as integrally dependent upon the biology, and then the remaining chapters are emphasizing that bodily and environmental and biological character, starting, for example, with language as first and foremost a practical perceptual skill involving development in discursively articulated environments, and seeing how that is very closely entangled with other aspects of the material practice of equipmental nexuses, as well as dealings with our surroundings. And then a chapter on power, which is looking, well, the chapter, you've got the chapter on normativity, but the chapter on power, which is emphasizing the problems in social theories of power, which leave out the body, vulnerability, leave out the materiality of social relations, and also leave out extensively the role of vulnerability and of materiality in the body and the reconstruction of environments in shaping the dynamics of social power. And then the final chapter, which takes up an issue that has been suppressed all the way through the book in order to bring about this conjoining of the social and the biological, but which is emphasizing that the environments that we are part of are integrally multi-species, and talking about the ways in which, among other things, our interdependence with other organisms and requires our ability to work to negotiate with them a shared way of an interdependent way of life, even though we do not and cannot negotiate with them discursively. So that's the not so short answer to the first question. Now, concerning human animality, that's really where the posture chapter is starting to bring that out, and to emphasize that everything we do is an embodied, developed skill, which is always interdependent with material environments of which other bodies are integral parts. Of course, social theory has tended to separate the social, the relations to other people from everything else. On the one hand, you can't do evolutionary theory that way, but I'm arguing you also can't do social theory that way. right? That you're really involving that all the time. And this really comes out centrally in the discussion of language as immersed in our ongoing bodily engagement with practice differentiated environments. And so in a sense, the two chapters you have after the introduction are the ones that are connecting all of that emphasis on human biology to the standard literature on social practice and normativity. Now, in a sense, your third question is really the central one, right? That is, how do I actually get here? In particular, to this notion of two-dimensional normativity. And although this is not a book on the evolution of human capacities, it's certainly dependent on some very good work that's been done by others and draws on that. So there are really three things that I think are entangled in that shift, which has differentiated us from other organisms, not in kind, but in precisely by this history of iterated transformative niche construction that starts with the kind of cooperative interdependence, which people like Kim Sterelny and Kevin Leyland, and actually you in your book, and Derek Bickerton in his work on language, have emphasized as a crucial turning point in hominin evolution, well before the emergence of modern, behaviorally modern hominins, as they're sometimes called. Second, that cooperative interaction enabling practice differentiation such that one is both, people are able to live in very different ways that depend on other practices being performed by others. And third, the emergence of discursive and conceptual articulation, of which language is, of course, very prominent, but not already emergent. I mean, I'm completely in agreement with people like Bickerton and Daniel Dorr and Eva Jablonka and others whose work I draw on, to talk about the co-evolution of language and the human lineage. But also, I want to emphasize that language does not stand alone. Your book on A Million Years of Music has certainly been in the background of that, but also the recognition of the shift from tool use to equipment, where equipment is interconnected and role differentiated, which becomes very much part over several million years of hominin evolution, and other conceptual practices, from music to imagery to dramatic impersonation, all of which are interconnected practices as in performances to which one is both have their own normative concerns internal to them and their answerability to other things. And so the final point there, and this may be a point where we begin to differ a little bit, I do think that language and conceptual practices more generally really do have a substantial evolutionary barrier in all organisms, and there took very weird circumstances for that to be overcome in the hominin lineage. That, I've been very influenced by Kim Sterelny's earlier work that emphasizes the emergence of flexible responsiveness to interconnected. He talks about environmental cues. I think that's separating them too much. Part of the point is that you get sophisticated animal behavior, very sophisticated, cognitively rich, precisely by not moving to symbolism, by being closely attuned to what from our perspective are interconnected environmental cues, but from their perspective are actually not differentiated, right? And that getting to conceptual practices took a very substantial difference. And so you have, on the one hand, very rich cognitive capacities in other animals that are in some respects much better than ours, and in any case, often quite different. So I think there's a lot more to say, but I want to have other people to have a chance, so I will stop here.
Great. Thank you, Joe and Gary. Mark, are you ready?
Yes, I am. Hey, let me join in the chorus of thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here in this session. I've known Joe's work for a long time, and it's wonderful to see it evolve and develop. I'm gonna take this the social theoretical parts of this, and by that I mean not just the practice theory, but thinking about this as a work in social theory in the social sciences. And all too often, social theory in the social sciences seems to be a kind of abstract language we can use to bamboozle the hoi polloi, but I think it's got a lot more a lot more concrete function. It provides a theoretical framework for explanation and understanding, and so adopting different kinds of social theories give us different sorts of resources for understanding the social world. Where I'm going to go today, though, is in the methodological implications. Different social theories tell us where to look for evidence, what sort of stuff is going to be evidence, and how that evidence is going to be relevant to our understanding of the social world. Practice theory has been important for this for a long time, and Joe's work has been a contribution to it. And so the question I want to address a little bit, and I don't really have any challenges for Joe. I guess the question is, am I even in the right ballpark? Maybe I should have read chapter 2 before I went here, but so I'm not speculating. But no, so I think that Joe's what I'm going to call nature, culture, practice theory. I think if this is going to have payoffs for the social, I think this does have payoffs for the social sciences. So the question is, how does the nature, culture, practice theory differ from traditional practice theory methodologically? What kind of methodological recommendations are different? What's the payoff? So let me start with the way I understand traditional practice theory. Again, emphasizing the methodological side part of this, and we might call this the Gertz, Winch, Wittgenstein axis, right? So traditional practice theory does a couple of things. One, notice that it enshrines a nature-cultural dualism. And this is witnessed by both Winch's and Gertz's arguments for the methodological distinctness of the interpretive science as opposed to other ways of understanding the social world. For Winch, this is a consequence of the difference between we like the language of norms. Winch talked the language and spoke the language of rules, between rules and causal regularities. Crucial distinction for Winch. And on his view, you can only get at rules through understanding practices, and there's all the difference in the world, and no understanding of causality is ever going to get you at what the rules are. So there's really two kinds of inquiry we can have. For Gertz, this shows up as a concern with meaning rather than causes as well. So again, it's the distinction between the space of reasons and the space of causes, and methodologically, each is giving us reasons to think that human life has to be understood in the rule or the thick description kinds of terms, and that causal questions are going to be of limited usefulness, if useful at all. One of the crucial questions that comes up for traditional practice theory is a concern with boundaries. Because of the way that normativity is conceptualized in early practice theory, like Winch, it's important to understand the regularities of the practice are going to determine the oughts within the practice. And so the early work in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s was sort of focusing in on this question of how do we draw these lines. A more sophisticated version of this, and I think Joe's own work is a contribution here. I guess one of my questions for you, Joe, is whether we now should be talking about the early Rouse and the late Rouse, or whether this is so. Anyway, early Rouse. I mean, one of the moves that gets made in thinking about the shape of practices is to point out that what is and is not a practice is normatively determined from the inside. So whether a certain pattern, regularity, event is following the rule, or even the sort of thing we might say is right or wrong socially, is something that you can only see once you're following the rules. Once you're playing the game, given the rules of the game, then you can understand what the boundaries of the game are. That's again, I'm still just describing traditional practice theory here. Another characteristic of traditional practice theory is that it's ahistorical. Temporally remote practices have no real direct relevance in understanding the current practices. They're all screened off by our current self-understanding. And if you make this move that what is part of the practice is determined from the inside, part of what we're doing there is understanding, complying with a norm, following a rule, doing what's socially expected, as being reinvented constantly. That when I say this is the rule, I'm saying this is how you ought to do it in the future. And by the way, this is how we've always done it, right? So there's a kind of constant reinterpretation of the past, which means how we actually did it in the past gets screened off by our current self-understanding. I think this has methodological consequences I'm going to get to too. Finally, the most direct methodological consequence of traditional practice theory is a demand that understanding humans is going to require engaging in a local practice. So paradigmatically, participant observation, ethnography are the kinds of things that are going to do the best job of this, though obviously there's other ways of doing it too. Whatever you're doing, you've got to learn the local rules. You got to learn the local meanings by being able to come to use them. You come to understand them by using them, and that means participating in them. And then that material that I've come to understand as an ethnographer or a social scientist by engaging with the rules is precisely the material that I will use to understand and explain that social world, or at least, even if I can get more theoretically abstract than that, it's going to be tied down to it. So that's the Gertz, Winch, Wittgenstein axis. Now, turning to Joe's nature cultural practice theory, I think it does a number of things that open this up methodologically. I mean, first, obviously, I think there's a sense in which a participant observation, if we're thinking just of the nitty-gritty of methods, is going to remain a super useful framework for understanding human interactions. But what I think is important is that the nature culture perspective has consequences that open that up in dramatic ways that I don't think either Gertz or Winch or traditional interpretivists in the social sciences would be able to accept. So I'm going to point to three consequences. First, on Joe's view, this, I guess, is the first dimension of normativity. Nature itself is already conceptualized as already normative. So normativity no longer constitutes the bright line between the space of reasons and the space of causes. And in fact, as I'm reading Joe, there's not really a need to draw a boundary around the practice at all. So the boundaries of the practice, I mean, this kind of concern fades into the background. And so crucially, that means what's part of the practice and what's not is not up to the participants in a way that it is on a traditional Winchian or Gertzian kind of view. And this means that the nature culture practice theory means that we're not committed to methodologies that are first personal in this sense. And this is exactly where Winch and Gertz are coming down. There's a sense in which, I mean, they're not thinking like Cartesian subjectivity here, but there is a sense in which you have to understand the social system from their point of view, whatever that means. That may not be the case here. So we might want to use agent-based modeling, for instance, as a way of coming to understand practices either in the large scope or in the local scope, right? And is that how they're understanding their own practices? Well, maybe not, but the evidence might come in from different places. So a second. And my second and third points here draw on the niche construction. I'm going to kind of artificially pull those apart into a more social and a more physical, but I'm not imposing a dualism here. I'm just kind of turning the sculpture and seeing different sides of it. So one feature of the nature culture practice theory is that practices create multi-level social environments. And I think this is really interesting from a social theory standpoint, again, from the social sciences, is that in the way that it breaks down the structure agency dynamic. So in the social sciences, there's, for decades now, there's been lots of forehead gripping and agonizing about the relationship of individual agents to the social structures. Or if you think in practice theoretical terms, how do agents interact and create, maintain, reproduce their practices? And usually this is the typical conceptualization is as a bunch of autonomous agents making choices that then maintain or disrupt or exploit social structures. So even if there's some sense in which I can only be the kind of being that has a language and beliefs and so on because I'm in a social world. All right, we can grant that. The typical way of setting this up is, okay, so I've got my views and my strategies and my goals, and then there's this stuff out there which is the practice or the social structure, and how can I exploit that? How can I use it for my own ends? What do I do perhaps unintentionally that reproduces it, and so on? That's the way the dynamic gets set up. Nature culture practice theory gives us a very different perspective. As Gary was emphasizing, the niche construction goes all the way down, right? So it's really better to see this as a range of interacting structures at different scales, either both temporal, large and small temporal scales, and large and small spatial scales. So where's the agent in all this? Well, it's somewhere in the middle, right? That's just not an important question. So a second more methodological consequence of this multi-level social environments is that cultural evolution is going to be a thing in the way it wasn't a thing for Gertz and for Winch, for traditional practice theory. To understand these interacting structures, we're going to need things like ethological studies. Animal studies are going to be obviously relevant. A modeling of cultural evolution is obviously going to be relevant. And I think history becomes relevant in a way that it couldn't have been relevant before. So just, the history of a certain form of communication, the rise of telegraph cables, for instance, in the 19th century, you can look at that and use that to explain features of our practice from a practice theoretical standpoint. And of course, people do this already, but it's not the kind of thing that if you were an interpretive social scientist, you would find especially useful. But now on this conception of practice theory, it's obviously useful, even if the people currently engaged in the practice don't know that history. It's been forgotten or sublimated or something like that. Finally, the third point is that practice is about the material embedding of practices. This is the more physical side of the nature culture practice theory. So by breaking down the barrier between the practices and the material environment, it lets us see practices as partly constituted by what would otherwise be regarded as a kind of material scaffolding, right? Sure, we have this material stuff on traditional practice theory, and our practices take place within it. The way I'm understanding Joe is we shouldn't think of a boundary there. That the practice, the actual material consequences of large-scale patterns of practice result in material changes to our environment. This could be spatial arrangements of architecture, land use, historical or concurrent, technology that we inherit and repurpose, technologies of the self, both physical and sort of psychological. All of these things become explanatorily relevant in a way that they're not directly explanatory relevant when you've got this kind of first personal prejudice that comes out of, well, I'll now say prejudice, that comes out of the Gertz, Winch, Wittgenstein axis. By the way, that's where I cut my teeth. That was me growing up, right? And it's people like Joe have talked me out of this. So I think the upshot is that nature cultural practice theory lets us be practice theorists and be methodologically very pluralist. Causal explanations are going to be just fine, and more traditional practice kinds of ethnographic explanations are also fine. But we shouldn't draw lines around them and say, well, this is, I'm limited to this sort of stuff. I can't look at, say, an agent-based model or the history of the technology that's standing behind this a couple layers deep to understand the current social world. I think these are all benefits. So am I playing in the right sandbox, Joe?
Yes. I would start by saying that Mark's account of the transition from traditional practice theory to the kind of use I'm making of practice theory is pretty much on the mark all the way through there. There are a few points that I'm going to emphasize and draw out of those remarks. And I'll start with the very point about methodology, because this book was actually preceded by a book that was emphasizing the niche constructive character of human conceptual capacities on the one hand, and scientific practices on the other, in the ways those are mutually supportive. And that has implications for how we think about methodologies in disciplines, because part of what that book argues is that disciplines are constituted by the interdependence of conceptual relationships and material tools, but which are also accountable beyond themselves to their relations to other disciplines. And that's the point that I want to make first and foremost about the social sciences. There are lots of places where the social sciences productively use methodologies that largely bypass the kinds of themes that are in my nature cultural account. And I'm happy to say that there are sometimes that's perfectly legitimate to do that, but it also then has to be held accountable and responsible to its larger context and how those issues get embedded in a larger, more comprehensive picture. And this is part of what was at issue in that beginning of the introduction on philosophy, on nature culture and the relationship to Peter Godfrey Smith's notion of a philosophy of nature. So this is not dictating methods to the social sciences, but dictating the accountability of those methods and what they disclose to other disciplines and what is being left out and has to be accommodated. So that would be the first point. Among the points that I would highlight, first of all, in your discussion of the Gertz-Wittgenstein axis, is that thick description doesn't stop with the human, right? Indeed, understand, and this is, Gary Tomlinson would certainly, I think, agree with this, that, understanding other organisms and their environment, where the environment of the organism is not its physical surroundings, but what is, what actually affects its way of life. And those, of course, are mutually determining. You can't understand the way of life except by asking what's the environment it's responding to. You can't understand what its environment is without its way of life. And that is a very thick descriptive enterprise. And so the notion that this is a separate domain of the social and culture is part of what that chapter is getting at. Of course, the notion of the internality and from within the practice as character of practices is part of what the emphasis on biological interdependence and practices as differentiated is aiming to undercut, right? Because on the one hand, that traditional view is right. That is, and this is part of comes out of the normativity chapter, that there are distinctive kinds of goods in the broadest sense and possible ways of evaluating and assessing things that are instituted by practices and that are often developed in the working out of the practice, but they never stand alone. They're always dependent on other practices and including the discursive practices to which we articulate and express what we're up to and argue about it. So that would be an important part of that. And actually, Mark Lance's work and mine have some common ground there. I would also emphasize one of the crucial points, and this is where my use of practice theory is drawing extensively on the developments on the anthropological side, is challenging this notion of the unity and internal coherence of practices. Part of the point of this account of practices is that a practice differentiated way of life is fragile. That is the ways that we are mutually dependent upon other people fitting in with what we do, but they're constantly not following the script and we're not following theirs. And so you've got this constant non-equilibrium dynamics, if you want to call it, both within practices and of the relations among practices. And that, of course, bears on the historical question, because crucially, on my account, practices are not synchronic. They are temporally extended, and not only dependent upon their history, where much of the content of the supposed rules and norms are actually embedded in the practices themselves, but also in their prospective character. Because often, of course, part of the function of a norm or rule is to recognize that following that got us in trouble. and so it's which of course is often contested. So it's emphasizing the power dynamics and the differentiation internal to practices, as well as their dependence on, but also potential clashes or divergence from lots of other practices as the characteristic human environment, is one of the central themes of the book. I will add one point, which I could have made in response to Gary, but one of the consequences of this book is that although I am deeply indebted to a lot of the literature on cultural evolution, including Gary's wonderful books, in the end, on my account, and this is partly what I think is a consequence of radicalized niche construction, the notion of two different modes of evolution, genetic evolution and cultural evolution, falls away. There's evolution, which involves natural selection and niche construction each developmentally and ecologically situated. And so this is not a separate mode of evolution. It's merely the fact that human evolution has involved extensively differentiated and iterated forms of niche construction over thousands of generations, and that has utterly transformed the environments that we are part of and dependent upon, even while it has also changed the other organisms that we are intimately involved with in things like what I call the co-domestication of other organisms, because we tend to forget in talking about domestication how much adaptation human beings who are working with domesticated plants or animals are having to be domesticated by those organisms. and how much that is part of the practice differentiated part of things. So let's see, is there anything else? Oh, let's see. So I think those would be the main themes: the multi-level, the character of practices, their internal differentiation, their temporally extended character, their involvement with not just material circumstances, but also our extensive biological interdependence with other organisms. Just one little point I would throw in as a finishing point in response to Mark. One of the points I make at several points, but extensively in the final chapter, is that there is so much discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic as this kind of external imposition on our social life, which transformed it. And that is a seriously misunderstood aspect of the pandemic. What one has to recognize is what we call social practices in our social world, among other things, involved a long coextensive interdependence with lots of other organisms, including other microbes. And this was a new microbe, which of course, in all likelihood, emerged from the ways in which we're dealing with other animals as well, disrupted the equilibrium we had achieved with other microorganisms. And so this is a further intervention, nature cultural intervention in our nature culture, in which we realize the extent to which, say, our classrooms and our economic practices and lots of other things are carefully adjusted to the kinds of microbes that we've evolved with. And these new ones didn't respect that. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful. You ready to go, Mark?
I am.
Great.
I want to thank you, James, for inviting me to this, and thanks to the Tautegory Project and to the respondents, and especially to Joe for this wonderful book. Unsettling though it is to think about, Joe and I have been talking about these issues in the vicinity of this book for several decades at this point. And it's also going to become clear that I've read the whole book as I'm teaching it next semester. Now, I'm actually more occupied these days by activist and organizing concerns than strictly philosophical. I write more about nonviolent revolution than logic and pragmatics in my old age. So I'm going to suggest a reading of some of Joe's points that helps us change rather than merely interpret the world. Chapters 6 and 7 develop a theme important throughout the book, that human social practices institute norms at several levels, and that those norms take on both semantic and pragmatic shape. We humans, that is, construct our niches by communicating with one another, and that communication is centrally important to the structure of our various engagements with our environment. In particular, Joe reminds us that both reasoned empirical investigation and hierarchical authority are social, environmental, linguistic practices. Each embodies a particular pragmatic structure, and that structure shapes the coordination of our engagements with practices and environments. As Quill Kukla and I have argued in detail, the very idea of an empirical observation requires a complex structure of social practice that is itself essentially object and environment involving. And Joe's conception of environment community co-constitution, I think, deepens this picture in important ways. At the same time, the power to command is itself a social accomplishment. As Joe says, any capacities to affect or control what others do and to achieve whatever goods people aspire to through that control depends on supportive alignment with what others do in relevant material settings. In what follows, it's going to be important to distinguish the mere existence of a practice or a given norm, role, authority, or power within that practice and the institutionalization of that norm. As I'm using the term, an aspect of practice is institutionalized to the extent that diverse, widespread, and mutually supportive other elements of practice serve to reinforce the aspect in question and to determine it as the way of doing things. Joe says human environments are also two-dimensionally normative. What is at issue is how people respond. What is at issue in how people respond to this field of alternatives is not only their survival and biological reproduction, but also the many normative concerns constituted and enabled by the practices composing those extended environments. So, for example, when science is operating well, scientists do not merely happen to seek out intersubjectively verifiable observations and draw conclusions from those in the space of reasons. Rather, practices like replication across laboratories, peer review, tenure review, credentialing, patterns of epistemic deference, all serve to reinforce the dominance of that mode of conclusion generation. It isn't merely that we have a bunch of people who do things scientifically. We have a vast network of mutually reinforcing practice that institutes this as how that is to be done. To take an example at the far end of linguistic practice, consider US laws. Legislators may offer reasons for the laws they pass, but the laws themselves are imperatives that people take to be binding upon them, regardless of whether they are convinced by those reasons. And the entire edifice of policing, prisons, weapons manufacture, as well as things like fences, walls, and electronic surveillance, function to see to it that these practices retain imperatival force. How we divide up our institutionalized social practices between those hierarchically structured around the commands of rulers and those arrived at through the agent-neutral and intersubjective normativity of the space of reasons will vary wildly across cultures. It's not as if science, however we might demarcate that, is the unique province of observation and argument and politics, that of violence-enforced imperatives. Alongside the prison industrial complex of the US, there exists as well the deliberative economic democracy of Mondragon, the restorative justice practices of the Zapatistas, and truth and reconciliation commissions. Murray Bookchin, a philosopher many of you probably don't know, urged some 50 years ago that domination of nature was of a piece with and mutually reinforcing of social domination. The institution of a social practice that treats nature as an exploitable resource governed by a profit motive will also be a social practice that treats most humans as wage slaves. And the basic argument is clear enough. If we see our environment as ours, in the plural, and decisions about how to use it as ones we must make together within a horizontally organized democratic community, then naturally the practical inferences of what to do will arise out of agent-neutral conclusions drawn from intersubjective evidence. Collective practices lead to collective niche construction governed by the space of reasons, or at least they can. A good concrete modern example might be the community decision-making in Zapatista, Chiapas, drawing on thousands of years of indigenous practice. On the other hand, if our engagements with our environment become institutionalized around a regime of property, then questions about how a part of the world should be used will not typically be raised in the agent-neutral pragmatic space. Rather, if this land is mine, and I can do with it as I will because it is mine, and in a capitalist economy where survival and flourishing depend on profit maximization, what's good for me is maximal extraction of value from what is mine. Once we institutionalize the further layer of corporatism, so that there are not even individuals embedded as they are in multiple non-capitalist moral practices, but merely abstract entities entirely defined by their place in the profit maximizing extractive economy, it's hardly surprising that our niche constructive activities begin to look like mountaintop removal mining or Royal Dutch Shell in Nigeria. Bookchin further argues that this exploitative relationship with nature will mutually reinforce exploitative relationships with other people. The more I extract from nature, the more economic power I have, and hence the more coercive power over others, which then allows me to use them to further extract from the environment. Joe says the significance of biological vulnerability in constituting social power is clearest for those most severely constrained. Many people are rendered more vulnerable to hunger, disease, overwork, violence, environmental hazards, or premature death by how others' situated actions and capabilities align within practices. Bookchin's point is that we can isolate specific ways that capitalism and other authoritarian practices generate these vulnerabilities and dependencies, and that the goal of respecting others' freedom or the world's viability requires directing our political energy toward those dimensions of practice and those environmentally dominating constructions. Which brings us to my second theme. Institutionalization of a power structure is never absolute. Joe was just talking about this. Power is always contested, and mapping the wildly complex interacting dimensions of social cooperation that underlie a given ability to order or control provides us as well with a recipe for subverting that power. This is actually the fundamental point of theorists of nonviolence like Gene Sharp. For example, the apartheid regime of South Africa leveraged ownership of mines and factories within a world economic system that financed the profession of police and military to enforce that ownership. But that same world economic political system constituted the power to boycott, to divest, and to governmentally sanction. The specific environmental context of mining extraction made possible occupations that were difficult to root out without destroying the value being extracted. Factories systematically exploiting groups of workers generate the labor solidarity of national strikes. Now, it's a commonplace of nonviolent activist theory that one should begin by analyzing the most vulnerable points of cooperation underlying a given system of oppressive power with an eye to withholding that cooperation. And of course, in thinking tactically about such things, activists consider the particular ways that constructed environments build out the power in question. Where are the entrances to this lunch counter? How can we infiltrate? Where will police arrive? What technology do we have to make visible to large numbers of people the resulting open and direct state violence? Joe's account of the environmental dimensions of social power go far beyond what is standardly discussed in these contexts, however. And it therefore promises to be of real concrete value to those who work for a different world, who recognize the long-term catastrophic consequences of capitalist niche construction, and who strive both to build alternative forms of life and to defend them from the violent systems that will inevitably strike back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm really glad that you bring out the fact that this book is intended to have broad-ranging political import for thinking how we think about political activism and the normative concerns for the sake of which we engage in that activism. And I want to start with a point which I think also could have been brought out in response to Gary and to Mark Richard, and that is, early in your remarks, you talked about instituting norms at several levels. And a central part of what I'm doing is challenging traditional notions of norms in relation to practices. and in particular, the discursive articulation of what the norms are. Because there's a tendency to think of the practice over here, and then here, especially think back to Mark Rishord, the social analyst saying, here's what the norms are. And part of what I'm arguing is that discursive practice is integral to that network of practices, and that the ways in which we talk about and thematize and theorize the normative concerns that are at issue and at stake in our practices is part of the practice. And so when I was saying in response to Mark that practices are contested, so are the norms and the descriptions of those norms. And that, of course, also has, has implications for the kind of activism that Mark is talking about, because, of course, merely talking about the norms is not sufficient to actually reshape the practices. That is, almost invariably, one gets at new normative concerns or newly articulated or redirected normative concerns by changing facts on the ground, by resisting particular practices and institutions, and by developing the kind of language that enables people to articulate what it is they're up to and what they should be up to, and how it differs from what they have been up to. So that dynamic is a character of language as integral to practice is a central part of the book. Now, Mark, talked rightly about the importance of institutions. Two things that I would add to that remark. One is, of course, and Mark was agreeing with it, I think, that you can't talk about institutions in the way many social theorists do without talking about the building of the relevant infrastructure and the ways in which the infrastructure changes the possibilities for what the normative concerns can mean. One example that I briefly talk about in the book is the extent to which the reconstructing of the housing and transportation infrastructure in the U.S. in the post-war to World War II period that transformed and instituted a more extensive form of racial segregation changes the very possibilities for what it can mean to build a racially just society. It's transformed what that could mean, and not just what we have to do or overcome. So that would be one kind of point. Also, institutions and have these much more complex interdependencies, which are also thereby more vulnerable. So the point about power and resistance being always closely entangled articulates that further with institutions. And as you get things institutionalized in practices is in multiple and complex and mutually reinforcing ways, there also opens up lots of opportunities for severing those relationships. And so my account has a great deal in common with very dynamic accounts of social power in people ranging from Foucault to Thomas Wartenberg to Clarissa Hayward or Torsten Minga, all of whom I find instructive, but almost none of them are sufficiently building in the infrastructural and material side of things, even though they sometimes do that. And part of that is, as another theme in the book, emphasizing that you can't separate power and domination, what's usually called power over, from the kinds of capacities and abilities enabled by those institutions and practices. And that goes back to the point about normative concerns internal to practices that I was mentioning in relation to Mark. So let's see, what else do I, yes, of course, the notion that institutions produce legal imperatives also are themselves contested and resisted, right? We all know how effective the speed limit laws are in keeping everyone in accord with that particular imperative. And so, expressing and articulating and even enforcing a rule is interdependent with the ways in which that is taken up and engaged with, and hence a dynamic account of that is crucial. I guess the final point I will add here is that in talking about the difference between authoritarian practices and the practices of groups like the Zapatistas and other, and other more anarchistic or egalitarian communities, Mark talked about the designation of things as ours rather than mine. But part of the point of this book is also to put that ours in question, right? To emphasize, although it, it's set aside to the end in order to bring the integration of the social and the natural together, to then remind us that that integration has other organisms centrally a part of that, and that it's not just ours, that any viable way of life for us is going to involve renegotiating the ways in which we deal with and respond to and affect other organisms and are affected by them. And that has to be part of our politics. So I'll stop there and see where other people want to come into the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you all. That was just exciting and great. We have plenty of time for questions. If people want to use the raise hand feature, we can do that. I don't know how unwieldy we will be, so it may make sense to one at a time also unmute yourself. I imagine there also may be questions not just to Joe, but to other respondents or between respondents. So feel free to jump in where you see fit.
I might as well start. First I want to say thank you to all of you. I mean, this really is remarkable because the range of things that I wanted to take notes on just got completely out of hand. And I'm sure that's probably true for everybody else, because at almost every juncture in this conversation so far, there are so many things come up that need to be explored more thoroughly and in more detail. So I want to start with a couple of things that are really very general, and maybe because of that, a little bit impertinent. I found myself having to read through most of the first chapter before getting over my resistance to the term that you used to describe the entire project as nature culture. And the problem there is that you have that as a linguistic exemplification that already does a number of the things that the argument itself is arguing stringently against. Because if you put it that way, you've just taken two already thoroughly established terms and yoked them together as if simply yoking them together would provide for some kind of actual synthesis. I don't think it does, but I think you know that perfectly well. And the problem is, how do we then sort out, what you should even call, this project? Because the project itself, as I think, Mark, actually both Marks, but Mark Lance, I think really put this in a very precise focus, and it could be reconstructed because it has a great deal to do with how these things are involved in the process of teaching. What do we even mean by teaching, and what does it do? Do we understand the infrastructure of that as a practice? And I would argue that we probably don't. We simply learn to do it, and then we continue to do it. So there is, I think, a continuing series of questions that I'd like to just start with, where you consider how it is that we look for sources of exemplars. Now, where do we have the sources that we draw upon, to make whatever particular point we're aiming at? Now, those are already embedded in a history. They already have normativity on every side, so that we've chosen to look at these particular examples, and it then leaves us in a curious position where all of the the more or less, ominous implications that if you have power that emerges out of your institutionalized practice, then that power is something that can be used in an entirely different normative register. It can be to suppress, to stop, to prevent, and that in itself will then produce, the impulse to protest, to try to change, to impede or to destroy. I was thinking all the way through this about where different kinds of examples might come into play, where all of the subjects, all of the themes and motifs that have run through this conversation are actually present, and it never occurred to us to include them because they're not within the institutional practices of the departments in which many of us have either studied or taught. So if we take, I'll take two things, and this is partly because of just circumstantial things: moving furniture, and herding cows. Okay, now if you take the case of moving furniture, all of you had the experience if you had to help a friend move more than once, and particularly if you have a pickup truck, you're likely to get on it all the time. But if you've got a piece of furniture to move that is very difficult, it's heavy, it's bulky, the geometry is wrong, and you're trying to get somebody to help you, it may be a job where the case that you're trying to move, the box in which this furniture came, says this will require a crew of 6, and there are 2 of you. Now, how do you learn how to move furniture? Now the acquisition of a skill like that, I think, exemplifies all of the subjects that everybody has brought up in the questions and in the answers. Because it is interactive. You have to have somebody with you who knows that if you're lifting a piece that's too heavy for you, they have to know exactly when to intervene, to put a hand on it so it doesn't fall over and crush them. Or how you have to get a dolly underneath a heavy piece so you can get around a corner and not ruin your kitchen cabinets. Now what happens here is that if you learn how to move furniture, you've learned some skills that are not the kind of things that you would find in the exemplars that come out of academic subjects. But boy, are they important. That is, can you observe and actually see what's going on so as to know, here is a point at which I can intervene, and if I intervene in the right way, the job will get done, and if I don't, somebody's going to get hurt. Now I take the second one, herding cows. Now you wouldn't think in an academic discussion that there'd be very much point in talking about herding cows, but if you've ever herded cows, you know that you're dealing with something that is an extraordinary requirement for skill. You have to keep, first of all, your eye always on the cows that are leading the movement of the whole herd. And if you don't do that, then you won't know where to position yourself, because what you have to do is get to the point where the lead cow can see you. And sometimes it means you might have to crouch and run along in a ditch so that you can get to the position where you stand up and you appear before the cow, and the cow quits going in a direction that would be disastrous. And you learn how to do this, and then the very simple things that you have to do in order to get the cows to respond in the way you want. Now, the one advantage here, of being a person and not a dog, the dog can do most of this herding cows much better than we can, but we're not inclined to go over and bite the cow. Now these are examples where you say, well, now how would we extrapolate from that to the actual subjects, of the practices here? I think there are a couple of things that I think would be very useful. And that is to recognize that the relation between skills and practices, is a lot closer than we may think. And what we do when we teach, where we got our examples from, we're teaching a lot more than a practice. It's how do you recognize what's going on? As I was taking notes, on these chapters, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I mean, they're engaging. This is really important stuff. But I kept writing in the column, how about taking a Henry James novel? You want to take a Henry James novel and say, what does somebody have to attend to make sense out of what's going on in what Henry James describes? Now, usually we pick examples that are a lot more simple than that, because you can say, learn how to do this, pay attention to the metaphor, look at the situation, include the history, but it includes things on the part of somebody who's looking at the situation, difficulties that are intractable when you're there, as it were, herding cows. Now, if the cows happen to be the 35 freshmen in your class, they wouldn't want to be called cows, but you better be able to think partly that way, so that you recognize what's actually going on. Are they getting the examples that you're presenting? So in that respect, I think there's a really wide open arena in this whole subject that we're talking about that does come back to teaching and where are the exemplars coming from. Now, one of the things that's happened in most of these debates, and it certainly is clear in the citations that both, Joe and all the commentaries have reflected, it's following through the very thing that I pointed out at the beginning of this diatribe I'm on right now, nature culture. All of the examples come from scientific practices, either in the natural sciences or in social theory. Now, this is a complaint that's very old. What it leaves out is the humanities. Because what the hell do people in the humanities actually do? There's another thing that kept occurring to me both in reading and listening to this. One of the few really quotable things from I.A. Richards from about 1966, 67. And it's not a good book, and I.A. Richards is not a very reliable person to follow, but he sure as hell had a lot to do with the practice of how you establish the use of texts in reading. But this quotation is this: he says, "The world is presently perishing for want of effectively capable people." And he's spot on in what he's talking about. What does it mean to be effectively capable? It isn't that you have learned a particular practice and you can turn it into rules if you want to go that way, or you can take it as hints. But what is it that makes somebody effectively capable? It requires, coming to terms with all of the intersections and the interdependencies here. Because that's, I think, where we really have to deal with another matter that I think runs through this whole discussion so far. How do we deal with contingency? A contingency is not something that you can predict in advance, and that's what it is. And it's not something that can be isolated and say, well, now the contingency in this case was this particular thing, and now we'll generalize it and make it into a rule. But if you do, that doesn't take into account that the next time it occurs, you're going to have adaptiveness on the part of that effectively capable person to say, in this particular situation, what should I do? What would be the best thing to do? And I better stop because I've gone more.
There's a lot to respond.
Yeah, well, I think I've got a fairly compact response on these. There are a number of points that are very well worth responding to. First, starting with the point about taking over the terms nature culture, I'm reminded of a paper that Susan Oyama wrote, very relevant figure in these debates. It's with the title, "What do you do when all the good words are taken?" Right? And the answer, of course, is that you reinterpret and reuse them. And in fact, that final chapter is entitled Finitude, and it's about two aspects of our dependence which go beyond the classic notions of finitude and people like Kant and Heidegger. One of these is precisely the dependence upon the language we already have, not as something that already determines us, but as the resources from which we have to work, right? And the other, of course, is our interdependence with other organisms. One of the things you used, Leroy, was the talk about having power and using it. And that's part of what my power chapter is challenging, right? Power is not a substantive phenomenon that you have or use. And that's because of the kinds of dynamic interdependencies that Mark Lance was talking about. And so one of the conclusions of that chapter is the, in addition to the intertwining of power over and power to doing various things, is what I call an expressivist conception of power, that power is not something one possesses, but rather it's a way in which it provides us with a set of conceptual resources for talking about how our causal interactions with one another in circumstances reshape the normative significance of our possibilities. So power is not a thing, but rather a process and a way of articulating and critically assessing that process. I would, ironically, moving furniture is one of the cases that I mentioned in the postures chapter, precisely because I want to emphasize the ways in which other human bodies and material things are jointly part of the circumstances to which our postures, skills, and ills are developed in response to. Likewise, in another context, I have a fair amount to say about herding cows in two ways. First of all, as Gary knows, is one of the classic cases of what is called gene culture coevolution is the evolution of lactose tolerance, right? But of course, part of my point is that that's a small fraction of the interdependence of people and cows, right? That the kinds of skills, life practices of dairying and everything else involved with animal agriculture utterly transforms the ways of life, skills, capacities, is practical perceptual orientation of the people who engage in it. And finally, contingency, of course, is crucial to that dynamics of the temporal dynamics of practices. Mark Ristor was talking about this kind of classic Goetzian notion of practices as having established and sort of being conceived as eternal, even though they're constantly changing. But in fact, of course, any alignment of infrastructure, institutions, performances, roles, and so forth is constantly encountering new contingencies that require adjustment. And so that non-equilibrium conception of practices is central to the book. And I'll stop there.
Mark, get in there.
This is nothing but an amusing factoid. I've been doing some work on the microbiome, and which of course it's going to fit exactly what Joe's talking about. But on the subject of gene culture interaction and cows, there is so not everyone has the same capacity to break down lactase or lactose, but there is a species of bacteria that lives in some people's guts, which breaks down the lactase and feeds on it, right? So we're the host for this, which then enables people to drink more milk. And there's evidence that this is passed from parents to children, and it exists in communities. So for communities that don't have the human genetic adaptation, we've got a microbiome adaptation that allows the same behavior. So this is at least 3 species involved here, probably more. Anyway, just like I said.
And of course, the fact that all eukaryotic organisms are now understood to be holobionts, which are intimately symbiotic with microorganisms, just reinforces that example.
Excellent. Other questions, responses out there? Henry.
You're muted.
There we go. When I try to unmute, a lot of times I get a little white hand instead of the arrow, and I try to get rid of it, and it won't be gotten rid of, so it takes a minute. I just wanted to a small point. Well, partly, maybe it's not so small. Leroy, I liked a lot what you said. And Joe didn't respond to the duality that you drew between the sciences and the humanities. You asked, what about the humanities? But in general, your whole thing reminded me of something that I was a little worried about from Mark Richard's remarks. Mark, you talked about the Gertz-Winch-Wittgenstein triad, and but you really didn't talk about Wittgenstein. You talked about Winch's Wittgenstein. And I wondered if, because it seems to me that the kind of thing that Leroy was talking about is much more the kind of thing that, is sponsored by Wittgenstein's later work than the kind of that practice theory has picked up. Because Wittgenstein doesn't make these divisions between the space of reasons and the space of causes and so forth. So I would just like to speak up in defense of Wittgenstein here and say, let's not conflate Winch and Wittgenstein. Does that sound fair to you?
Absolutely. The history of practice theory has been sort of the history of a slow uptake of a lot of Wittgensteinian insights. And I honestly, I'm not sure how much we should read back into Wittgenstein. I think this is an interesting, open question from, say, Joe's point of view. But yes, certainly it's Wittgenstein's inspiring. In fact, Wittgenstein's the link between Winch and Gertz. They don't, Gertz doesn't refer to Winch as far as I know ever. But he's certainly directly inspired by a particular reading of Wittgenstein. Not exactly Winch's, but it's the sort of, Winch, Rees, Strawson early uptake of practice theory that's crucial for their understanding there. But yeah, your point is very well taken.
Thank you.
And I would add that Mark's heard this. I've given a paper that was, did some of the themes of the normativity chapter specifically for a Wittgenstein in practice volume, and emphasizing that one of the things that the Winch tradition leaves out is Wittgenstein's remarks about this as part of the natural history of human beings. And I'm agnostic about how strongly that should be taken in Wittgenstein. But I note that some of the people who know Wittgenstein much better than I do emphatically reaffirm that this was, and especially reading a lot of the manuscripts, it's not even some of the ones that aren't published by that industry, emphasize that that's really central to Wittgenstein's way of thinking about that. I didn't respond to Leroy's point about the humanities, but I certainly do want to emphasize the kinds of literary constructions, narratives. It's only briefly discussed in the book because the topic would take you a long, long ways, but it's emphasized that the humanities are a crucial form of niche construction that transforms the kinds of goods and concerns that we care about, and that we, are factoring into this complex two-dimensional normativity of our ways of life.
Thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to sneak in, if I can, Leroy, and ask Joe just two really basic questions that I think might be instructive. They're kind of two words, bad old words we've got. One is environment and one is person. And I would wonder if you could say how you see personhood looking differently alongside of environment looking differently.
Well, I mentioned a little bit about environment already. That is, we really have to think about the environment of an organism as keyed into its way of life. And one of the points that this account of human ways of life does is to recognize the diversity and interconnectedness of human environments, and in such a way that on the one hand, things like Henry James novels, and on the other hand, dairying practices are integral components of how we live, and to a certain extent dependent upon one another, although not by immediate connections. So, really emphasizing that the human environment is nature cultural, where one doesn't see this as two distinct things conjoined, but rather prior to having them attempted to be torn apart. On persons, of course, I have a long engagement with Wilfrid Sellers on, which nevertheless still involves a certain kind of dualism about person subject to norms and the natural world in the scientific image. And so I would want to emphasize that persons in this strong sense of normative, reasoning and discursive, socially and institutionally complex, are embodied animals, and that this is integral to our environment, and that one has to think about personhood as not something distinctive and other than our environmental embodiment.
Excellent. I think I've got Mark Lance and then Gary. I think AJ, was there a question from AJ? Or no, I'm seeing, sorry, chat. So Mark Lance, Gary, and then Terry.
I was going to change the subject, so if you're following up on this current point, go ahead.
Gary, are you?
I'm going to pass it over to Terry because we need some new people
Yeah,
talking.
let
here.
Terry talk first.
Great.
Can you guys hear me? Great. Yeah, I was wondering if there was any consequences for your thinking on the increased automation and embedding of norms in, things like media creation software and other kinds of technologies where, like, nature and culture, I guess if you include artifacts and, other kind of mediums of information into culture, then, you can sort of have a connection there. But in my area, and thinking about making video games and sort of aesthetic experiences with these tools that are connected to all sorts of other systems, trying to get students to think differently from like best practices, but also the sort of repertoire of making that comes embedded within things like engines or other kinds of software. I think it's really difficult challenge to go all the way back to Mark Lance's point about how do we change, if we're sort of thinking about these things in this way, like how do we change the norms? I was wondering if you had anything to say about that.
I don't say a lot about technological infrastructure of various sorts, except I do make the point that human cognitive capacities are not just something that was genetically involved, but in fact are very closely shaped by the kinds of cognitive tools and practices that we engage in. And looking back at some of the literature on writing, on printing, and looking at computer technologies and visual imagery and the ways in which the kinds of cognitive capacities that matter and the kinds of possibilities they have are entangled with that ongoing development of how people develop their cognitive capacities in particular equipmental and practical environments. So it's a central topic. I don't have a lot to say about it in detail. That's the kind of thing that someone who was convinced by the kind of account I'm giving would want to do it as a major study, or multiple major studies in their own right in these terms. But it's certainly a very relevant kind of concern.
I think I have Mark Lance, Gary, and then Henry.
Okay, Joe, I wanted to ask you a question about this point about our interdependence with other living beings that you comes up at the end and that you mentioned in response to me. So there's an ontological sense in which that's true, right? No matter what practice we're talking about, we're doing it with other critters, right? And that's true, you know, pick an example of Jonathan Lear's, that's true whether it's the practice of crow life interrelated with the bison, or the practice of colonization, where Europeans kill all the bison so that the crow have to leave and ethnically cleanse the land. Both of those involve the bison. What I wonder about is how we talk about this in detail. So I think I know a lot of detailed things about hierarchical versus horizontal ways of relating to other people. But every one of those is going to talk about them in terms of communication and language and things like the difference between talking together to figure out what's true and giving each other orders that are followed up by coercive power. We don't talk to the buffalo, except in stupidly metaphorical ways. I mean, we're not going to go very far explaining anything in terms of that. So how do you think about that distinction, that emergent distinction that, you know, roughly the difference between the crow's engagement with the buffalo and the US cavalry's engagement with the buffalo? How do you think about that structurally when you don't have language as a tool for the description of the practice?
Yes. Well, a couple of things I want to say about that, because it's a very, very important issue. One of the things I want to say about it is, and this is really in the final chapter, is to talk about the fact that recognizing and responding to our interdependence with other organisms, and while recognizing that our discursive articulation of those norms and our reasoning about them is with one another, is one of the more crucial imperatives. Because although they don't argue with us, they do respond to what we do in consequential ways, and that has to be taken up into our discursive practices, as well as you know, as something that is a causal imposition on our way of life, as what they do in response undercuts some of what we do. Second point that I want to make is, you know, it's not just the buffalo, right? The extent to which extinction or transformation of the ways of life and environments of other organisms have been integral to the global expansion of human beings, both European, but also the movement of human populations out of Africa across 7 continents, and, you know, involved transformations and destruction of other species, include that the ways in which other species respond and cause us to respond to them includes going extinct. That is the ways in which the efforts to, you know, the kind of thing that is one extreme involves co-domestication, in which we adapt to organisms that adapt to us in various ways, also includes those organisms that do not or cannot or will not adapt to coexistence with the kinds of practices that we engage in. And that is a meaningful response. It is one in which many aspects of how we live, and as well as, of course, their inability to live, are transformed by their final gesture of saying no, if you like. Not saying no, of course, but living in ways that are consequential, not just for themselves, but for us and for other species. And that has to be part of our politics, more broadly construed.
Gary, go ahead.
Well, I'll try and make a couple of semi-coherent comments about things. One thing is that it seems to me that the question of niche construction has been entering into this conversation at different registers and in different ways. Some of those I'm tremendously comfortable with, others I'm not so comfortable with. So Joe, You said a few moments ago in response to Leroy, well, the humanities is a mode of niche construction, and so here's my problem with that. I'll go back to a musicological parable. There was a movement around 1990 in musicology whereby everybody was trying to think about, of course, we had long been trying to think about social context for music making, but suddenly it seemed apparent to some people that you could read the social context right out of the notes themselves, right? And, you know, to say that Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 5 is enacting class structures in the 18th century is on one level. Yes, of course it is. On another level, no, of course, the notes are not, and it would not even have entered into the practice of Bach to sort of think that notes could do such a thing. So there, you know, in the same way, the granularity of radicalized niche construction is such that it seems to me we always need to be in touch with scales that are so much smaller than the scales of institutionalized practices of one sort or another, such as the humanities and the modern university, that to say that the humanities are a mode of niche construction is to do violence to the whole way and beautiful way in which you're bringing niche construction on board in your argument. That's one comment. Can't hear you.
So that comment was that offhand remark was not about the humanities writ large, but the particular kinds of multiple and diversified practices that make up the humanities are integral to our practice differentiated lives, and instituting, creating, transforming normative concerns that become integrated into that, what I call horizontally different and vertically differentiated ways of life. And that has to be on that kind of granular scale that you're talking about. So when I talked about the humanities, I was not talking about them en masse, but in their scales. And you know, this was a book where some choices had to be made. One of the referees who on an earlier version who rightly said that the book needed to be shorter, and it now is substantially, they did qualify that by saying, it is true that the book is about the entirety of nature and culture, but, and so there are gestures towards, you know, the ways in which, for example, the kind of thing that is classically discussed as the rise of the novel was a transformation of ways of life, but integrated, of course, with certain kinds of practices, but also transformative. And likewise, you know, I would not be very happy with suggesting that we could read class structure off of Bach, even though, in fact, Bach's music is very closely involved with a lot of other practices. And so it's, again, the granular scale, which sometimes works on a much larger scale. And, you know, that's part of the multi-level analysis that what you have as chapter 5 was talking about. There are times when very small innovations at a granular level can then affect other practices in ways that require internally quite substantial but it's got to be traced in that kind of granular way. It's not, you know, grand holistic theses about that are not going to be very informative, at least I think.
Good. So I've got Henry. I'm going to jump Raquel ahead, and then Leroy, unless anybody who hasn't asked a question or made a comment yet, I'll give you priority on that. But Henry, why don't you jump in?
You're muted.
All right.
Remuted.
You're still muted.
How about, okay, press Alt A. Christ, what is the problem?
You're not muted now. Now you are.
It's itself again, all by itself.
Now we can hear you.
Okay. I tried to text this to Terry, but I apparently don't know how, I mean, to chat it, but I apparently don't know how to send a chat. So I wanted to just ask you, Terry, have you, are you into Andy Clark? Relating to your
Say
question.
again, and Andy Clark?
Yeah.
No, I'm not.
Embodied cognition, but broadly construed.
I think Clark works all the time on how the cognition uses things like electronics and all kinds of prostheses, technological prostheses of our bodies and minds. I'd recommend Supersizing the Mind is a good place to start. But I think he's one of the most important philosophers writing today. And it's true, he's a close pal with Dan Dennett, which I think it has a bad odor in some circles, but I think they've done some dynamite work together. And yeah. So that's mainly what I wanted to say. But then I wanted to ask also Joe, did you get involved with the inactivist paradigm, broadly speaking, including the recent work on Peirce that's being done by people like Kathy Legg? I seem to remember some reference to that in your book, but
yeah, the inactivist or the 4E or 5E tradition is very informative of the book, but it's less detailed in the art. I do say something about that, and I am very much engaged with that tradition. It's complementary to what I do. The book is agnostic about the distinction in between that they draw between people like Clark, who integrates that with a more traditional computationalist account, and somebody like Tony Chimero, or Michael Anderson, who go in a more radically embodied cognitivist direction. That's central to the themes of the book. Part of the point for me is that they talk less, Clark does some, but they talk less about language and other conceptual practices, including things like music. And I want to emphasize that, although the book Linguistic Bodies by DePaolo, Cafari, and DeJager does that from an activist point of view. I would throw in, by the way, that I think of myself as a pal of Dan Dennett, who disagrees with him a lot about evolution, but with whom we have a lot in common. And there's a lot in Dennett that needs to be taken very, very seriously.
Good. So I've got
Informative.
Raquel, Stephen, I'm gonna drop in next, and then Terry back again.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this really great conversation. I've been playing a bit with niche construction in the realm of infrastructure studies, which is a bit of a subdiscipline of science and technology studies. And I've used it in terms of thinking how particular marginalized populations in the use of public transportation actually develop what I've been calling belligerent technique to get around in a system that is largely hostile to them. And I guess I have a question that kind of draws on Mark Lance's work on questions of activism. And Joe, I would love to maybe hear your thoughts, and anybody else who wants to jump in on this, where I understand our conversations around normativity to be rather broad and not necessarily to be talking about questions around desirable worlds, like what world do we really want to live in? And can we make these particular normative claims of what are worlds that are desirable, and is that world a socially just world? So I guess in becoming aware of practices of niche construction and in having these conversations in a broader scope, including policy making, I wonder how we might use, or whether it's desirable to use, the ideas of niche construction as something that does create more livable and more socially just worlds. And I know it's a broad question late in the game, but I'll throw that one down there and scurry.
Well, I take that to be very much part of what Mark Lance was really picking up on, that and part of my point in this is that the kinds of normative critique and the kinds and the normative concerns we evoke and the ways we articulate them and the ways we build them into practices are integral to this ongoing dynamics of practice. So I certainly want to include resistance to forms of power. I want to include political activism as part of the dynamics of practices and part of the dynamics of power that are, which also involve very much embodied ways of adapting to. So you're talking about transportation infrastructure, which is actually one of the examples in the discursive practice chapter, which is emphasizing the ways in which it's different modes of transport and are both integrated into one's bodily inhabiting of an environment, and also in different practices is located in more specific. So the cars or bicycles or wheelchairs or whatever else that shape what is our accessible space are also bought and sold. They are damaged and repaired, licensed and taxed. So you've got both our immersion in a bodily accessible world in which the available and alternative modes of transport shape that environment, and also they're caught up in a wide range of other practices. So that's exactly and that those also involve notions of power and resistance, which, for example, in Clarissa Hayward is, talks about the ways in which those kinds of considerations shape power in school systems. So, we're on the same wavelength here, and but that's one of the things that will be consequences of how do you use this kind of analysis rather than analysis that I'm actually undertaking.
Mark, I'm assuming you have something to hop right on the back of this.
Yeah, really quickly. I want to emphasize, I think there's two themes from the anarchist tradition that can be translated into Joe talk that respond directly to what you're asking here. One of them is that a long tradition throughout the whole 19th century, sort of responding to some sort of crude Marxist ways of saying we could just write up what the perfect society is and lay the blueprint for it. The anarchists always said that in Joe's terms, our ability to see more just futures is itself a niche construction from where we are right now, and that every step of liberatory change makes possible further vision. And so it was always seen as a kind of dialectical process. So you absolutely can't see all the kinds of either the kinds of oppression or kinds of liberation that might be possible, because you'll be able to see more as soon as you do some of that. And the second dimension of this is the idea that I think is crucial for political action of prefigurative action. That is to say, building local sort of models of different ways of living precisely to make it possible for us to articulate kinds of critiques and stuff. And here I just want to point to the work of Alexis Shotwell, who I think has done some really, really brilliant, detailed work on how that goes. In her book, Knowing Otherwise, she talks about the construction of separatist queer housing units in Canada and the way that enabled discourses of trans lives and gave people the ability to engage with one another in a new vocabulary that made it possible for identities to be articulated and things of this sort. So yeah, I think taking this systematically seriously, that making shit up is one of the things we do within our socio-natural environment. And if we change the latter, we'll change what we can do in the former.
I completely agree with all that. Just two quick points. One is that changing the ways what we do and the ways we live, and changing the ways we talk about it are really, really tightly integrated. But also the kind of point that Mark was making about utopian communities, alternative practices, and so forth, are not just producing an example that we can then think about, because the very effort to bring them about in current arrangements is already transformative of the space around them. It's not first you create this new alternative, this utopian space, and then we use it as a model. The very creation of it is transformative in its relations to other institutions, practices, ways of life, and so forth. And that's part of any political activism, is making that happen.
Great. Hopefully we're doing a bit of this niche constructive work right now. And Stephen, you're up. I've got Leroy next, I think, if that's right. But Stephen, go ahead.
Great stuff, Joe. I put my hand up when the recent conversations had been about co-domestication between humans and non-linguistic animals, and about granularity. And of course, I always push you on the animal cognition side and the ethology side. And I'm just thinking that, yeah, you can talk about that with respect to species level or very large group level co-domestication like dogs and cattle. But it also happens at individual and group levels. I remember visiting you when you had, I don't remember whether it was parakeets or canaries, and it was a very unusual household environment.
They
If you've ever known
all
anyone
around the house.
exactly, if you've ever known anyone who had a cockatoo, you know, that they form very unique sorts of relationships with human beings, essentially treating the human as their mate. And this forces, you know, very atypical adaptations in the human's social world. But at the group level, there's this very interesting story of a short-lived cooperation between a group of whalers in New Zealand and a pod of orcas, where they cooperated in hunting humpbacks. And the story tends to emphasize that there really seem to be rules to the relationship. And it abruptly ended when the humans one day violated one of those rules. The orcas just went away. And so, you know, I think there might be interesting things to explore at smaller granular levels in human, non-human animal co-domestications.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with the main point, right? It's not just the species that coexist, but the organisms that coexist, and the diversity of human practices and the diversity of human animal relationships are very, very comparable. My general take on things is that what I call conceptually articulated practices, as far as we know, are unique to human evolution. And even though other animal practices and ways of life are extremely sophisticated and often involve very complex forms of social interaction and so forth. That could be wrong about some other cases, and whales and dolphins are the most interesting possibilities for something more akin to the weirdness of us than some of the others. But that's something that I think is still lies ahead of us to see exactly whether this really sophisticated, complex, social environments of those organisms, including the ways in which they can take up us as in their, as part of their lives. Because a crucial part of all this is that organism environment relations are mutually encompassing, right? We are each part of one another's environments, and other organisms are part of our environments, and we are part of theirs. And just as our relations can be aligned constructively or misaligned, that can really be the case with us and others.
Great. I think if nobody else, I think we're to Leroy.
Am I unmuted now? I think so. I want to go back to something that Terry raised, but connect it to two other topics that came up, in the following out from Terry, particularly having to do with niche construction in the humanities. And that really requires, I think, a pretty delicate touch, because this really has to do with what's the nature of one's actual involvement with particular practices. Now, where I'd want to start this is to say that as just an opening conclusionary venture, practice always precedes theory. Until you got a practice, you don't know what it is you're theorizing about. And if we say that there are, conceptually articulated practices, the odd thing that happens, and this is something that I think anyone who's in a humanities department and has been for any length of time will recognize, that what looks like niche construction is something that may simply be another name for ideological capture, where somebody does not look at the practical consequences of what it is they are practicing, because they never get to the point where they actually have to deal with another person, with another species, with anything else. You're just simply dealing with the text that you read, and the conversations that you happen to have, and it can become extremely isolating. Now, with respect to Terry's point about the problem of technology, we have now every day enough horror stories about technology to say whether it is Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, or going back to a previous generation, where people imagine somehow that technology is a form of magic and the people who have it should be simply accepted as authoritative anyway. I'm tempted to want to play with their names, but I'll avoid that, because what's involved in technology that is really crucial is that if you're merely a user of the technology, you may not have any idea what's under the hood. You don't know what the history is. You don't know why certain things work or how they work. And in that respect, if somebody's involved in the creation of the technology, I mean, if you actually are doing coding, what that involves is a kind of practice where the resistance you have, is you want your particular routine to work, and you're not thinking about all of the things that it may do that are really terrible. Because just because you can establish a particular practice and somebody can use it for their own particular purposes, that does nothing to guarantee that the purpose is good, that there's a normative question here that has been addressed and answered, and that's where the multiplicity of things that may go into the formative practices ought to be included in anything whenever we talk about niche construction. Because you can construct a niche within an English department that consists of 4 offices in a particular wing of the building. And you don't talk to anybody else. And the only time you talk to your colleagues is when you fight over who's going to get the one appointment that's available for your unit this particular round. And then it's sort of like, this is a bad metaphor, but I'll use it anyway. You've got one lamb shank and you throw it into a room that's full of 25 very hungry dogs, and nothing happens there, and so there is I think a significant risk. Now, on the question of how literal do we want to be about practice, the ability of somebody to think that they're engaged in a practice, it's because it's already reached the point of something having been codified to the point where you start writing rules, or you say, these are the theoretical sources on which we will ultimately rely, and it doesn't take into account what's involved in a kind of learning. Now, this goes back to, a number of the things that Gary said, earlier. I recall an occasion where I was going to do a lecture in music school, and the point of it was that one of the things that ought to be taught to every undergraduate is not just a course in music appreciation, but something that would lead them to the ability to actually read the music, to read a score. And I was struck by this because I was sitting in the Union Building, in Washington, reading a score, and a person whom I knew was looking over my shoulder and said, "What the hell are you doing?" I said, "I'm reading this." And he says, "Well, what does that mean?" And if we have people who don't know what that means, just taking an introductory course in music doesn't give you anything like the kind of practice that music actually is. So, Gary's point about whether or not you can read class and social structure out of Bach's, Fifth Brandenburg Concerto is really telling. Because the very thing you need to do, just like if you want to understand how the technology works, try to write the code that produces the technology, and you will see that you're in over your head right away. And you need to talk to somebody, and you need to figure out, how do I think my way through this to see how these 2 or 3 lines of code have these extraordinary effects. If all you're looking at it's, you just put F10, you hit F10, or you do this with your mouse, and wow, look at this great stuff. That's not creating a niche. It is creating, an enclave. And it's not necessarily normatively good.
Certainly, niche construction is not necessarily normatively good. Among the practices that have their own internal goals and directedness include various forms of criminality, violence, destructiveness, and so forth. And and those depend on other practices and affect them in all sorts of ways. So there's nothing about this that's saying, oh, niche construction is wonderful. Indeed, this kind of massively iterated niche construction is not at all clear. To use the more traditional terms, was a successful adaptation, right? I'm reminded of Zhou Enlai's supposed remark about what he thought about the French Revolution, too soon to tell, right? Well, likewise with whether practice differentiated ways of life was a successful evolutionary adaptation. That's ongoing transformative. But I will say that, 2 things about the point about building little narrow enclaves. Whether you are, what the practice is you're a part of is not just simply up to you. And that's why this is all about the forms of interdependence that are involved in that. And that's why Mark Rischart's point about the Winchian kind of point of view is really under, a significant challenge here. That, on the other hand, no one ever reads a text in isolation. Reading a text is part of one of many things we do in a vertically differentiated life, and we bring lots of those resources in there. And then the final thing, before we start getting too much wondering about how much Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are early transforming our world, is whether Meta and Twitter will be around in 10 years. It's not that this is not all obvious, but I will leave it at that.
Great. Terry's up next.
Yeah, Leroy articulated what I was trying to get at way better than I could. I wanted to sort of reformulate what I had asked initially about sort of automation and proceduralization of practices in systems, whether it's Twitter or whatever. In my domain, just sort of thinking about things like game engines and how those connect to platforms for distribution, etc. What Leroy was saying about like herding cows way back at the beginning, I'm thinking about how my students come in and they sort of think, well, making game art or having expressive goals is this romantic idea of just sort of best practices being leveraged to pursue a goal, an artistic goal. And then the practices are mostly habitual or invisible to them. And part of the learning process is like, use another one of Leroy's figures, sort of like looking under the hood or getting at the code, even if it's not literally the code. But I do think a lot about like an accrued set of niche constructions, I guess, or like that are encapsulated. And I wonder that there's certain domains of experience where the challenge to meet like Mark Lance's sort of goal of like changing these norms is greater or requires different kinds of resistance. Is that intelligible, that comment?
I mean, part of what you're getting at, of course, is the point that Mark was making, that on the one hand, institutionalizing practices and also building them into infrastructure is an integral part of this kind of niche construction. It's one of the reasons why a part of my partial disenchantment with traditional practice theory is that it tends to leave out the ways in which much of our social relations are built into our environment, but which of course are never simply fixed and buried. They're always having to be maintained. They're always having to be transformed. They're always having to be accommodated to new contingencies. So, I mean, again, that's part of what this, I hope this framework opens up with, for more extensive kinds of consideration.
Excellent. I can see the darkness descending in various backgrounds. Us on the east are getting late. I wanted to ask if there's any final or concluding questions. If people have them. Yeah, Henry, go ahead.
Unmute, Henry. Oh,
There we go. Yeah, I've been trying. Well, I just wanted to put in a word for the concept that has gripped my imagination for the last 20 years, and which I think would clarify. So I think under the concept of practices, so many different kinds and levels of what we do are being like lumped together. And what I've been trying to do is to work on the concept of techne, as a very, a very clearly definable set of practices that we can talk about. What Leroy was talking about, like herding cows, that's a techne. There's a way of the right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. My mother's milk was late Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein, talks about, for me, the seminal passage in the Investigations is the passage in which he talks about imparting to a pupil, well, he calls it, how to go on, right? Which a rule, right? But it's more Wittgensteinian to think of it as learning how to go on. That kind of more basic sense, which for me goes back to the labor process. Lukács has some very interesting work on the concept of techne in Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle are where it gets started, and then Lukács jumped on it to talk about how it illuminates the labor process. So for me, because I'm not smart enough to travel in the realms of abstraction that you Pittsburghers travel in, Joe. So I need to grab hold of something more, more graspable. And for me, that's the concept of a techne. So I would just like to suggest to all and sundry that you consider whether the concept of techne might not be a useful one to bring in here and there in your cogitations. That's all.
Well, we've shared some of the same background, including the late Wittgenstein and the Aristotle. Oh, the notion of bodily skill as developed in environmental interaction is integral to all of this, and the ways in which they both involve interdependence with one another and environments, and also their discursive articulation, because of course the notion that there is a right way and a wrong way is typically talked about, and that talk and the evolving practice under changing contingencies are continually in interaction with one another. And it's that kind of dynamism of a differentiated way of life that I'm trying to get us to attend to, but emphasizing it is both bodily and situated, in which the body can't be understood except in what it's responding to and reshaping in this constant process of niche construction and being transformed and situated by it, selected by it in multiple levels.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to really briefly respond to what Terry said, because, I mean, at a certain level of abstraction, I don't think there's anything special about technology. It's always the case that our practices rely on a whole lot of other stuff. And it's also the case that most of it's always invisible to us. You couldn't get on and do a thing if you were thinking about the ways that the terrain and the gravity and the rocks and all the other microbiomes, there's always a massive background that for the most part goes invisible. But I do think, of course, there's a difference when you start inventing software to write other software, to write games. But where the details that matter seem to me to come out is precisely when you want to start altering the standing rules and norms of the practice, because that's when, or if we're taking more oppressive examples, if you want to throw your body on the gears of the machine, you better figure out which gears matter and where a body will matter and where you aren't just killing yourself in some grand gesture that no one gives a shit about. So, will cutting this cable here bring down the communication system of this country for the foreseeable future? Will putting a worm into this system make a difference? And that's serious activism involves first analyzing that. What points at which does non-cooperation or various kinds of intervention bring down a whole structure of capacities? How do we stop this machine from carrying on in the way it carries on? And that's where, and that doesn't get answered at the question of, are there dependencies and complex there always are. That's a complicated engineering question where you have to look at the details. And certainly technological interventions will be very different than less technological ones.
I'll just jump in here to say, I can say it now that she's gone, but Raquel's forthcoming book really tackles this, and she has some brilliant work on the much used figure of invisibility that kind of follows in a lot of infrastructure. Terry, I'll put you in touch so you can get an advanced peek at that, because it's really germane to a lot of this. And she's thinking through on the scalar question. I was so happy she could make it, Joe, because some of the things you were saying were just, I could see it in her eyes. So it was excellent. We've got 3 minutes till we're out of here. So that's,
what was the title of her book?
I'll email you, because
Thank you.
Yeah, she just got the approval on revisions. So, all right, Leroy, if you're going to do it, you got 2 minutes.
You're muted. You're still muted, Leroy.
Still muted, Leroy. We can't hear you.
Now that's okay. What Henry should have said, and he's too polite and too proper to say it. He's got a terrific book, on Techne. So look it up, get it. That's it.
Well, thank you all very much. Joe, we really appreciate you agreeing, and Gary and both Marks. It was a great session. I got a number of emails while this was happening. People were having traffic difficulties and all of that. I'll make sure to pass on to each of you a recording when we've got that set up, and we'll have it posted. Really exciting session. now I'm going to go run a couple laps in my house to work off all the excitement I have over here. So thanks
you.
everyone.
Thank you all for this. This
Thank
has
you.
been as an author, this has been just an extraordinary delight to be engaged with all of you about this. And so thank you very
Great
much.
conversation.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks. Thank you, James.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks,
everybody.
Joe. Great accomplishment, Joe.
Good night.
Good night.